Canada's housing crisis is getting worse, but where do we stack up globally compared to other developed countries that are also dealing with housing crisis? Are we worse off than them? Are we better off than them? Let's get into it into today's video. So, fellow YouTuber named Living in Canada put out a video about living in Canada and the housing crisis that we have. It's a detailed video. She left out a few things, but then she also provided some extra context and solutions at the end of the video. I wanted to add some more to the conversation because I like her videos and I wanted to show you guys. Let's get into it.
No secret that housing in Canada is getting increasingly unaffordable. In the past, someone with a regular middle-income job could afford a home much more easily than nowadays, causing a lot of young people to give up on home ownership altogether. A standard house costs almost twice as much in Canada as it does in the United States. The sad thing is just that it wasn't always like this. So let's take a look at how home prices have evolved over the years and not only answer the question of how unaffordable is housing in Canada, but also how unaffordable is housing in Canada really compared to the rest of the world, including the United States. Homes in Canada are expensive, yes, but what matters most is not just the absolute dollar amount, but more importantly, how affordable are homes. On an aggregate level, home affordability can best be expressed by using an indicator called price-to-income ratio. Let's say that your annual income is $80,000. A price-to-income ratio of 4 would mean that you would need to save up 4 times your annual income in order to afford the average home.
Yeah, that is a great way to kind of gauge the overall health of the market. That's not how a bank would qualify you. A bank uses something called your debt coverage ratio or your debt servicing ratio. I've heard different terms for it, but basically they will use a certain percentage of your income and, including debts, they'll plus minus, and they'll say, okay, you can afford up to 42% of your gross income. So if you make 100,000 a year, you can have 42,000 of that 100,000 is available to be applied towards a mortgage, and then they'll kind of work their numbers away from there. I just used random percentages. I've seen lower, I've seen 38%, and they do a factor in your property taxes and all these other things. I just wanted to clear that up because I've had conversations with people and they say, oh, I've heard it's 4 times your income or 5 times your income to buy a house. Not exactly. There's some new rules coming out that might impact that, though.
4 times $80,000 equals $320,000. Just an example. In 1980, the price-to-income ratio was 3.2. The average home price was $67,000. Yes, unbelievable, right? And if you earned the median income, which was $21,000 at that time, you'd need to save up 3 times that to buy your home outright. And over the next 2 decades, the price-to-income ratio increased to 3.4 and 3.5, which is still hardly noticeable. In 2000, which doesn't feel too long ago, the average home price was $164,000. You'd only need 3.5 times a median income of $46,750 to buy a home. Between the years 2000 and 2010 came the real shock, with price-to-income ratios skyrocketing, reaching 5.9.
So again, this is more of a national number, which I don't love talking in the national market because, for example, in 2010 in London, Ontario, where I am a real estate agent, reach out to me in the link below if you want to work with my team or all the way across Canada. We can select somebody for your area. But in 2010, the average house price, I mean, you could buy houses in London in 2010 still, and I'm not joking, for $80,000, $100,000, and you were still getting nice houses in good family neighborhoods. So it's a little tough to go by just markets because this is always going to be including Toronto, but because Toronto is where you might have heard this analogy from me before, where you drop the pebble is Toronto and then the ripples of price go out from there. So, the Torontos, the Vancouvers, maybe the Calgarys, but Alberta's pretty affordable. Their housing markets are all different. So national housing prices, it's good to show the metric of how the numbers are changing, but I really don't like using national house price.
earned a median income of $57,000, you'd now need to save up almost 6 times that much to afford the average home. This development was, of course, not unique just to Canada, but was felt all around the globe during the financial crisis. And unfortunately, it didn't stop there. Going on to 2020, housing affordability only became worse. The average home now cost $566,000, and with a median income of $84,000, one now needed almost 7 times that amount to buy a home. So if the news now are saying that housing prices are coming down, it's easy to misinterpret. Even though home prices are coming down a bit, it only makes a tiny difference because in the past, housing prices have already increased by so much.
Yeah, so 100% prices have gone up by such an extreme amount that even if it drops by 10 or 20%, it's still not going to get back to where it was. One of the solutions that I often offer to people, and I just had a conversation with somebody recently about it, and I do it all the time because if you are struggling to get into the market, consider a duplex, because when it talks about the income to price, the income from the duplex will help you on the qualifying. And especially if you're in a non-major market outside of Toronto, outside of Vancouver, you can find more affordable markets where you can get a duplex that's going to be able to help you get into the market and actually own a home. It's not ideal. Of course, just more affordable prices would be better. I'm just giving solutions to work inside the system as it currently exists.
Prices have increased significantly. But more importantly, the purchasing power for homes has gone down when taking into consideration Canadian income. One thing is clear, the money that you worked so hard for is continuously losing value, especially if not invested. In case you haven't started investing yet, an easy way to start doing that is using Wealthsimple.
All right, so I'm actually going to leave her link below. She has a referral link for Wealthsimple. Basically, if you're looking to sign up, she did a great job talking about it here. I use Wealthsimple. I think it's smart. I'm not going to use my referral code because she's doing such a great job with the video. So I will leave her referral code. If you're looking at signing up with Wealthsimple, check it out. It'll be linked down below beside where my real estate links are.
And both you and I will each get a referral bonus of $25 once your account is funded. Now back to the video. So the actual problem now is not the growth of home prices, but that the growth of home prices have exceeded the growth of Canadian incomes. NerdWallet summarizes this further. In the 40 years between 1980 and 2020, the average home price increased by about 746%, while the median household income rose by 295%. But is this problem unique to Canada, or do other countries around the world exhibit the same trend as well? Let's start by looking at the growth of house prices over a period of 12 years, from 2010 to 2022. Globally, 80% of countries have seen increasing home prices. So surprisingly, yes, there are countries in which home prices have not increased at all. In advanced economies, housing prices have increased by 77% nominally and 39% on average based on real price growth. So
something interesting about the advanced economies things, she doesn't get into it, but obviously we know almost all of the advanced economies where we are seeing rapid price growth, we are also seeing mass immigration, and then we are also seeing rapid money printing. And what happened is, we had our crash in 2008. Things started to turn around in 2009, started to bounce back 2010. And then, the money printing has just continued since then. And as we know, we've talked about it in other videos, but I'll mention it again here. All of our money is created through debt. So as we got higher mortgages and as more money was being printed, it puts more money into the system, which allows us to create more debt, more mortgages. And then all the money floating around means we've got more dollars and we don't have the assets because all the competition, especially with the immigration, is going to increase price.
So if we take inflation into account, Iceland holds rank number 1 for housing price increase with a whopping 202% in nominal price growth.
They had a major debt problem. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but they ran into a huge debt and money printing problem for a while.
Followed by Estonia, New Zealand, Chile, Turkey, and then Canada.
Bit of context for Turkey as well. Turkey's currency basically fell apart. It became worthless overnight. There was a whole thing where people were buying Bitcoin and stuff just to protect their money because their money, they were seeing it like 10% a day in inflation on there. So that's why the price growth is crazy, because their currency is worth like nothing now.
So, at 148% price growth in the last 12 years, Canada ranks pretty high on the list, ranking country number 6 worldwide with the highest increase in housing prices.
So basically, if you do compare us to some of those other countries where they just dealt with rapid, crazy currency debasement, we'd actually be higher. So we're number 6, including the currency debasement countries, which is not stellar.
Just think about it, housing prices have doubled in just a bit over a decade. And how does Canada compare to the other G7 countries?
You can kind of see again, Canada's price growth has outpaced every other country in the G7.
And as we always love to compare,
Our population growth has also outpaced every other country in the G7, even though they're dealing with, even though they are also dealing with mass immigration. They are growing by like 1-2%. We grew by like 6 or 7. It was something nuts.
ourselves with our closest neighbor, the United States, the US ranks number 13, with housing prices increasing by 118% in nominal and 63% in real terms. Still a lot, but a far cry from what we're experiencing here in Canada.
Zensurance wants to ask, are you self-employed without business?
And that's what frustrates so many people. We are right next to each other, and yet home prices in Canada are growing much faster than in the US. If that higher growth in prices were compensated by higher incomes, well, then everything would perhaps be fine. But unfortunately, Canadian incomes lag far behind, making it much more difficult to afford a home. Canada's gap between real estate prices and incomes looks ridiculous besides US data. And this will show you how much more unaffordable homes in Canada are compared to the US. Canadian and American.
It's not just that. I mean, one of the major differences between Canada and America that we never talk about enough is Canada's a huge country. The geography of Canada is massive. But when you look at the actual population of Canada, I think it's 80 or 90% of the population lives within 200 miles or 200 kilometers, one of the two, of the US border. And it's because we're just huddled up to the US for warmth, right? Like we are going, hey guys, we want to be close to you, part of your economy. The US is such a wide spread out country. You have diverse climates, you have diverse cultures, you have diverse everything in the US itself, like in that single country. And that's why you go to New Mexico and then you go to Maine and you go to different states and it looks wildly different. You can go to Houston, Texas right now and buy a 4,000 square foot home for like 500,000 just because of the way it's spread out. And they have a lot of like ghost towns that are happening now, and because of how much more they built and developed than us. And then also their population is not growing anywhere near the rate that ours is growing. So it's a hard comparison because we've got all this land, but everybody's in that same little zone track along the border where they've got this country that's like, whoa, it's like such a wide spider web of infrastructure and cities. So it's a big difference between the two.
American real estate prices versus disposable income. Let's look at the time frame between 2005 and 2021. From 2005 to 2021, home prices in Canada have increased by 139%. While US home prices have only risen by 10% in the same period. This means that Canadian home prices have grown by over 13 times in the same period. And although yes, the good news is that Canadian incomes grew faster in that time period compared to the incomes in the US, but not fast enough. As of Q2 2021, Canadian real disposable incomes increased by 46% from 2005. In the US, incomes increased by only 10% over the same period, so Canada grew faster. However, not nearly enough to justify the gap between home prices and incomes.
Bit of context on that too. Obviously, the 2008 crisis hit US way harder than it hit us. At the time, our price declines were pretty minor. We were almost in a stable market. It was a small pullback. Things certainly slowed down, but compared to what the blood in the streets was there. So when you go 2005 to 2021, you have their major crash in there, and they have since bounced back, but we had those years where we weren't really losing. That being said, the majority of our growth has really happened in the last 4 years. What happened in the last 4 years? Money printer was turned on, immigration skyrocketed, and then the other thing, which we've talked about, I'm going to talk about in another video, we've talked about it in other ones briefly, but I'm going to break it down a little bit more, is Canada is becoming a money laundering hub. There's just more money coming to Canada from these international places for people to wash it. And that is honestly having a direct impact.
Let's look at the chart again to let it really sink in. The red dotted line shows Canadian incomes, while the red solid line shows Canadian home prices. Home prices in Canada advanced 64% faster than disposable income. The blue dotted line shows US incomes, while the solid blue line shows US home prices. In the US, incomes advanced 16% faster than home prices, an inverse relation. So relatively to the US, it is much harder for Canadians earning a Canadian salary to buy a home in Canada. But what about other countries than the US? Are they also experiencing something similar to Canada? This chart here shows the price to income ratio in different countries. These ratios here measure the development of house price growth in 2022 compared to 2015 as base year. The higher the ratio, the faster the growth of house prices have outpaced the growth of income. In the Netherlands, the house price to income ratio was 146, making it one of the countries worldwide where house prices have risen the most in comparison to income in recent years. At
Also dealing with mass immigration and money printing problems similar to Canada.
least Canada is not the worst offender in this respect. But Canada is a very close runner-up. Just right after Portugal, the Netherlands, and Austria, Canada ranks number 5 globally in terms of house price outpacing.
And ironically, Portugal is getting destroyed by Canadians, Dutch people, by Canadians, Dutch people, and Americans who are now leaving and immigrating to Portugal, and then they're paying for higher prices at these places because they're looking at a lot of these properties as being cheap and affordable, where the locals are like, oh, that was expensive based on their incomes and these other things. So ironically, our problems are trickling over to Portugal. I don't know what's going on in Austria, but it's similar with the mass immigration. But the Portugal one is kind of funny that that's number 2, and the Western developed nations are going to Portugal and kind of causing that.
Earnings. And yes, the US is just right behind. Looking at Canada and the United States, we're looking at a very small subsection of the world. Surely both countries have a huge housing problem, but we've shown that housing affordability is much worse in Canada. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. What if you're already in Canada? While it's useful to know about all of these things, it's no use to just complain. On an individual level, there are a few solutions. The first one is earn more, obviously, much more. Homes in Canada will still feel ridiculously expensive compared to many other countries, but at least it will become a bit more affordable if you can catapult yourself into a higher earning bracket, into a higher net earning bracket, after taking into consideration the higher taxes that come with higher income, of course. Another option is to move out of big cities like Toronto and Vancouver, which are obviously the most expensive cities in terms of housing. And to illustrate just how much home prices differ across the country, let's take a look at this chart here and go through average prices in different markets. In 2024, the average price of a home in British Columbia was $1,018,000. In Ontario, $889,000. In Newfoundland and Labrador, $290,000. In Quebec, $511,000. In Manitoba, $362,000. In Saskatchewan, $334,500. Alberta, $491,962. In the Northwest Territories, $461,000. And in Yukon, $541,600.
So the Yukon one is actually one that really surprised me. I have very little information on the Yukon, so I didn't know that their house pricing was so high. This was a great example of how you can move to other areas like Saskatchewan, obviously way more affordable than either BC or Ontario. You know, a lot of people will say jobs and all that stuff. The bigger thing for me is being able to access your community. Like you want to be close to your parents, your friends, that type family overall. And those types of things I think are the bigger thing why it sucks to make an interprovincial move. But that's why if you are in the really expensive provinces, you know, primarily you've got Ontario and BC, because Quebec's pretty affordable, Alberta's pretty affordable, and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all like comparatively to BC and Ontario anyways. But you look at it, it's like, okay, where in Ontario can I buy? You have to find a community that is still close to where your family is ideally. Yes, it's going to be a little bit more of a drive, but versus moving out to another province where you're not going to be able to see people, that's a drive or a flight. And then people often say jobs. There's jobs in a lot of places. They're not always going to be maybe in the field you're currently in, or perhaps you can find something that's remote. And it is a shame that you have to think about moving out of your, hometown and your other area to find a place that's affordable for you. But then another solution, which I said earlier, buy a duplex, because believe it or not, you can even buy a triplex. That's probably going to be for the younger people watching, because if you're older or have a family, you probably don't want to live in a triplex. But if you can find a triplex that makes sense, like a building that's a nice purpose built, it's got 3 units, you can have a nice unit there, you can put down as little as 10%, and it'll help you qualify for that building to get into that single family home that you eventually want to get to in the future. So young people watching this in particular, look for duplexes, look for triplexes. But honestly, again, with having the conversation on the duplex and the triplex, if you're willing to do it, it's a great way to help you retire. And it is a great way to help your cost of living if you do have a small family and looking to build and save there too.
And if this still doesn't work for you, then perhaps consider moving to another country altogether. And if you plan to stay in Canada, the third thing that you can do is to vote in a better government that can hopefully bring about some improvements to the housing situation.
Heck yeah. So she's actually an immigrant, I believe, or I just made a generalization, but I'm pretty sure she said in one of her videos she's an immigrant. That being said, I don't think you need to leave Canada, because the only way that you leave to another more affordable country, and it makes sense, is if you have a Canadian or a US income anyways. You can't just move to Serbia and be like, oh, I'm going to get a local job in Serbia because it's more affordable. The salaries are obviously way lower there. The power of moving to these other countries is when you move there with either a US or Canadian or some sort of Western country income. But if you're going to be able to work remotely anyways, you want to stay closer and stay in, the country that you're going to be able to live in, unless there's other motives and stuff like that. So, I mean, ultimately it's up to you, but make sure you guys check out her channel. I'm going to link it down below. She puts out a lot of stuff. I've talked to her before. She's really nice. I actually reacted to another one of her videos previously too. Don't forget to reach out to me in the link below. Work with me as a real estate agent. Don't forget about the Axe the Tax Store. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like and subscribe, and have a great rest of your day.